The sound of cowbells rang through the morning air like a symphony of chaos. Sheriff Corinne was on the ground, her pristine uniform covered in dust, screaming threats at me while her spooked horse pranced circles around the corral. The news cameras were rolling. The politicians she had invited to boost her career were watching in horror. 3 months earlier, she had waltzed onto my family ranch like she owned the place. She threatened me. She humiliated me. She turned my peaceful property into her personal kingdom. But now, as those cowbells clanged with every movement, I realized something. Sometimes the best revenge is the one that makes the most noise. My grandfather built our ranch in 1952 with nothing but his bare hands and a dream. 3 generations later, I was still living that dream on 800 acres of rolling pasture in Montana. Every morning, I would wake to the sound of horses nickering in the distance and cattle lowing in the far fields. The sunrise painted our property in shades of gold, an amber that no city person could ever understand. I had 23 horses on the property, prize quarter horses that my father had started breeding back in the 70s. Customers came from 3 states over to buy our foals. We had a reputation built on honesty, hard work, and treating our animals right. In our small town of Cedar Ridge, population 812, that meant something. The ranch was more than just land and livestock. It was heritage. It was legacy. Every fence post told a story. Every barn beam had been placed with care. My family had weathered droughts, market crashes, and family tragedies on this land. We were respected in the community. We paid our taxes on time. We helped our neighbors during calving season. We donated hay to families struggling through hard winters. Then Sheriff Corinne moved to town. I first met her at a town council meeting in early spring. She had been appointed sheriff after our previous sheriff retired to Arizona. Corinne strutted into that meeting like she was running for president. Crisp uniform, polished badge, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She introduced herself with a speech about law and order that went on for 20 minutes. After the meeting, she made her way around the room, shaking hands and making conversation. When she got to me, her eyes lit up with interest. "So you are the one with the big ranch outside town," she said, gripping my hand longer than necessary. "Yes, ma'am, 3rd-generation operation. That is a lot of land for one person to manage." Her smile did not reach her eyes. "I bet you could host some amazing events out there." Something in her tone made me uncomfortable. The way she looked at me, like she was calculating something, like she was already making plans that involved my property. "We keep pretty busy with the horses and cattle," I replied, trying to end the conversation politely. Of course, of course." She finally released my hand. "But I imagine a good citizen like yourself would want to support community activities, law enforcement appreciation events, charity fundraisers, that sort of thing." I nodded non-committally and made my excuses to leave. But as I walked to my truck, I could feel her eyes on my back. There was something about Sheriff Corinne that reminded me of a predator sizing up prey. I should have trusted that instinct from the beginning. 3 weeks later, Sheriff Corinne showed up at my ranch unannounced. I was in the barn treating a mare with a stone bruise when I heard her patrol car crunching up the gravel driveway. The engine shut off, and I heard her boots on the concrete as she walked into the barn. "Beautiful facility you have here," she said, looking around like she was appraising the property. "Really impressive setup." "Thank you, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" "I have a proposition that I think will benefit both of us." She leaned against the stall door, blocking my exit. "I want to host a charity horseback riding event here next month for the Police Benevolent Fund." I set down my tools and looked at her carefully. "What kind of event are we talking about?" "Oh, nothing too elaborate. maybe 30 or 40 riders, some local politicians, a few media representatives, good publicity for everyone involved. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. Naturally, we would expect you to provide the horses, the facilities, the liability insurance, as your civic duty. Sheriff, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but this is a working ranch. We have liability concerns, insurance issues. I would need time to think about something like that. Her expression shifted. The friendly mask slipped just enough for me to see the steel underneath. Think about it. She stepped closer. This is not really a request. This is me telling you how things are going to work in my county. Excuse me. You have a lot of animals on this property, a lot of facilities. I imagine the county inspector has not been out here in quite some time. She ran her finger along the stall door, collecting dust. Fire marshal either, or the health department, or the ATF, considering you probably have firearms on the property. My blood went cold. She was threatening me, using her badge to extort cooperation. Are you saying there is a problem with my operation, Sheriff? I am saying that problems can develop quickly if people are not cooperative with law enforcement. She straightened her uniform jacket. But they can also disappear just as quickly when people are helpful. I stared at her for a long moment. Every instinct told me to throw her off my property, but she had a badge and a gun. She had the power to make my life miserable with inspections, citations, and bureaucratic harassment. I had worked too hard and come too far to lose everything over a pissing contest with a corrupt cop. When did you want to have this event? I asked through gritted teeth. Next Saturday, I already sent out the invitations. Her smile returned, smug and victorious. I knew you would see reason. What about insurance, liability waivers? Oh, you can handle all that paperwork. I have more important things to worry about. She headed toward the barn door. I will be by tomorrow to look at the facilities and make sure everything is suitable. Wait, what exactly are you expecting me to provide? Horses for 30 people, saddles, guides, maybe some refreshments, the works. She paused at the door. Oh, and I will need you to clear your schedule. This is going to be an all-day affair. She left me standing in that barn, shaking with anger and feeling completely powerless. I had been running this ranch for 15 years. I had never backed down from a challenge or a problem, but I had never dealt with someone who could hide behind a badge while making threats. That night I called my lawyer. He listened to my story and sighed. Technically, she has not broken any laws, he said. Unless you can prove she threatened specific illegal action, it is just your word against a sheriff's. I hung up the phone knowing I was trapped. Sheriff Karen arrived at my ranch Friday afternoon with 3 deputies and enough equipment to stage a military operation. They pulled up in a convoy of patrol cars and official vehicles, treating my driveway like their personal parking lot. Where do you want us to set up the command post? One of the deputies asked me, like I was the hired help. Command post. For security and coordination, Karen explained, emerging from her patrol car with a clipboard and an attitude. We cannot have civilians wandering around unsupervised during an official police event. I watched in disbelief as they began unloading folding tables, radio equipment, and barriers. They set up a checkpoint at my front gate without asking permission. They moved my farm equipment out of the way to make room for their staging area. When I tried to object, Karen cut me off. This is for everyone's safety. I am sure you understand the liability issues. By Saturday morning, my peaceful ranch looked like a crime scene. Yellow tape marked off areas where guests were allowed to walk. Signs directed traffic flow. 2 deputies were stationed at the gate, checking names against a list. The guests began arriving at 9 in the morning. Local politicians glad-handing their way through the crowd, news reporters setting up cameras, Chamber of Commerce members taking photos, and Sheriff Karen in the center of it all, holding court like she was running for office. "Welcome to our beautiful riding facility," she announced to a group of visitors, gesturing toward my barns like she owned them. "We are so pleased to be able to host this event here." My facility, our event. She was taking credit for everything while treating me like an invisible servant. "Excuse me," I interrupted. "These are my horses we will be using today. I need to go over some safety guidelines with the riders." Karen turned toward me with a look that could freeze hell. "That will not be necessary. Deputy Morrison is an experienced rider. He can handle any issues that come up." "With respect, Sheriff, these are my animals on my property. I am responsible for." "You are responsible for staying out of the way and letting the professionals handle this event." Her voice carried enough authority to silence the nearby conversations. "Unless you have an official role here, I suggest you let us do our jobs." The humiliation burned through me like acid. In front of my neighbors, local politicians, and news cameras, she had just reduced me to a bystander on my own property. But the worst was yet to come. Around noon, a reporter from the local television station approached Karen for an interview. They set up their camera with my prize stallion visible in the background, grazing in the pasture that 3 generations of my family had maintained. "Sheriff, tell us about this wonderful facility," the reporter asked. "Well, Sarah, we are incredibly fortunate to have found such a perfect location for our Police Benevolent Fund event." Karen gestured toward the barns and pastures with obvious pride. "This kind of community partnership is exactly what modern law enforcement is all about." I stood 20 feet away, listening to her describe my ranch like she had discovered it, like she had built it, like I did not exist. "The horses here are absolutely magnificent," she continued. "We have been working closely with the facility management to ensure everything meets our strict safety standards." Facility management. That was what I had become in her version of reality. The interview continued for 10 minutes. She talked about her vision for community policing, her plans for future events, her commitment to public service. She never once mentioned my name or acknowledged that this was private property being used without compensation. When the cameras stopped rolling, she walked over to where I was standing. "I hope you are taking notes," she said with that predatory smile. "This is how things work now. I have big plans for this place." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means you have a beautiful facility here, and it would be a shame if zoning issues or safety violations forced you to scale back your operation." She adjusted her badge deliberately. "Cooperation works both ways." I realized at that moment that this was not going to be a one-time event. She intended to turn my ranch into her personal campaign headquarters, and there was nothing I could do to stop her. Or so I thought. The breaking point came during the afternoon riding session. Karen had positioned herself on my best mare, a gentle quarter horse named Belle that I had trained myself. She was posing for photos, playing up her cowgirl image for the cameras, when one of the local council members made a comment about the beautiful property. "This is quite a spread," he said. "How long have you been developing this operation, Sheriff?" "Well, it has taken considerable time and investment to get the facility to this level," Karen replied, patting Belle's neck like she had raised her from a foal. "But I think the results speak for themselves." That was it. That was the moment something snapped inside me. She was not just using my property. She was not just taking credit for my work. She was actively erasing me from the story of my own ranch. In front of people who had known my family for decades, she was claiming ownership of 3 generations of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Actually, I said, stepping into the conversation, this ranch has been in my family since 1952. My grandfather. I think there might be some confusion here, Karen interrupted, her voice sharp with warning. Perhaps you should focus on your assigned duties instead of bothering our guests. The council member looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Karen had positioned herself as the authority figure, and I was just the help causing problems. I walked away before I said something that would give her an excuse to arrest me in front of the news cameras. That evening, after the last of her guests had finally left, I sat on my porch and stared out at the property that had been my life's work. The yellow tape was still up in places. Tire tracks from the patrol cars had torn up the grass near my barn. Cigarette butts and paper cups littered the ground around their command post. I was 53 years old. I had been running this ranch since I was 22. I had survived market crashes, droughts, and family deaths. I had never backed down from a challenge in my life. But Sheriff Karen had found the one weapon I could not fight: corrupt authority wrapped in legal legitimacy. Or had she? I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about Karen's background. What I discovered made my blood boil. 3 complaints filed against her at her previous department in Wyoming, all involving abuse of authority, all mysteriously dropped or settled quietly. A pattern of using her badge to intimidate citizens into compliance. I found online forums where other ranch owners complained about similar shakedowns. Business owners forced to donate to police charities. Property owners pressured into hosting law enforcement events. Always the same playbook: veiled threats wrapped in requests for civic cooperation. But I also found something else. Stories of people who had fought back successfully, not through lawyers or official complaints, but through creative resistance that exposed the corruption to public scrutiny. That was when I remembered the cowbells. My grandfather had used them during cattle drives back in the day. Big brass bells that clanged loud enough to hear across the valley. They were hanging in the old barn, covered in dust and memories. As a kid, I used to tie them to tree branches to scare my cousins during games of hide and seek. The idea formed slowly, like a photograph developing in solution. Karen was planning another event in 2 weeks. She had informed me, not asked, that she would be bringing an even larger group of VIPs for a law enforcement appreciation ride. State politicians this time, maybe even the governor's office. She wanted to use my horses and my property to advance her career. She wanted to play cowgirl for the cameras while treating me like hired help. Fine, I would give her exactly what she was asking for. A memorable horseback riding experience that she would never forget. I spent 2 weeks preparing for what I privately called Operation Cowbell. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency planned. I was not just pulling a prank. I was conducting a carefully orchestrated exposure of corrupt authority. The night before Karen's big VIP event, I worked alone in the barn until 3 in the morning. I had purchased 30 sets of cowbells from a farm supply catalog. Not the small decorative ones you see in gift shops, but the real thing. Heavy brass bells designed to be heard across miles of open range. The trick was attaching them to the saddles in a way that would not be immediately obvious. I used leather straps to secure them under the saddle blankets, positioned so they would remain silent while the horses were standing still, but create maximum noise with any movement. Bell got special treatment. Since Corinne always chose the best horse for herself, I made sure Belle's saddle carried the largest and loudest bells I could find. 3 of them, strategically placed for optimal acoustic chaos. I finished the work just as the sun was rising. My back ached from bending over saddles all night, but the satisfaction I felt was worth every minute of preparation. Corinne arrived at 8 sharp with her usual convoy of official vehicles, but this time she had outdone herself. 2 news vans, a photographer from the state newspaper, 3 state senators and their staff members, even a representative from the governor's office. "I trust everything is ready for our distinguished guests," she said, inspecting the horses with the air of a general reviewing troops. "Everything is exactly as you requested, Sheriff." She was dressed in her finest uniform, polished to perfection for the cameras. Her boots gleamed. Her badge caught the morning sunlight. She had even added a cowboy hat to complete her frontier law enforcement image. The guests gathered around as Corinne gave them a safety briefing that made it sound like she had been running horse operations her entire life. She talked about proper mounting techniques, hand positions, and safety protocols like she was some kind of expert. "These are exceptional animals," she told the group, patting Belle's shoulder. "Trained to the highest standards and perfectly suited for riders of all experience levels." The irony was almost too much to bear. At 9:30, Corinne gave the signal to mount up. I held Belle's bridle as she climbed into the saddle, fighting to keep a straight face as she settled her weight onto 30 pounds of strategically hidden cowbells. "Easy, girl," Corinne murmured to Belle, who was shifting slightly under the unfamiliar weight distribution. The other riders mounted their horses with varying degrees of confidence. Politicians who had probably not been on a horse since childhood were trying to look comfortable for the cameras. State senators were adjusting their borrowed cowboy hats and attempting to project an image of rural authenticity. Corinne raised her hand to signal the start of the ride. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what I am sure will be an unforgettable experience." She was right about that. The moment Belle took her first step, the bells under her saddle erupted in a symphony of clanging chaos. The sound was even louder than I had anticipated. Belle's eyes went wide with shock and confusion. She spun in a circle, trying to escape the noise that seemed to be following her everywhere. Corinne's political composure evaporated instantly. She grabbed the saddle horn with both hands as Belle began prancing and spinning, the bells creating more noise with every movement. But Belle was just the opening act. As the other horses heard the commotion and began moving to investigate, their own hidden bells joined the cacophony. 30 horses, 30 sets of cowbells, and 30 riders who suddenly found themselves in the middle of an acoustic nightmare. The carefully orchestrated photo opportunity transformed into complete chaos in less than 10 seconds. Politicians were shouting over the noise. Horses were spinning and backing up, confused by the alien sounds attached to their bodies. News cameras were rolling, capturing every moment of the mayhem. And in the center of it all was Sheriff Corinne, no longer the composed authority figure, but a panicked rider clinging to a spooked horse, while brass bells announced her loss of control to the entire county. The chaos lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I timed it. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of pure, unfiltered pandemonium that destroyed 6 months of Corinne's carefully constructed public image. When the last horse was finally calmed and the last cowbell silenced, Corinne sat in her saddle staring at me with an expression of pure hatred. Her perfectly styled hair had escaped its tight bun. Her uniform was wrinkled and dusty. Her face was red with humiliation and rage. "You," she said, pointing at me with a shaking finger, "you did this." I maintained my most innocent expression. "I am sorry, Sheriff. I have no idea what could have caused that commotion. Maybe something spooked the horses." "Do not play games with me." She dismounted from Belle with unsteady legs, her professional composure completely shattered. This was sabotage. This was deliberate interference with an official police event. The news cameras were still rolling. The politicians were brushing dust off their clothes and trying to recover their dignity. The photographer from the state newspaper was reviewing his shots with obvious delight. "Sheriff," one of the state senators called out, "perhaps we should postpone the remainder of the ride until you can determine what caused this incident." Corinne's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles bulging. She knew exactly what had caused the incident, but she could not prove it without admitting that she had no idea how to properly inspect riding equipment. "There seems to have been some kind of equipment malfunction," she announced to the group, shooting me another venomous look. "We will investigate the matter thoroughly." "Equipment malfunction." The reporter from Channel 7 stepped forward with her microphone. "Sheriff, this looked like the saddles were deliberately rigged with noisemakers. Do you suspect sabotage?" "I suspect criminal interference with a law enforcement event," Corinne snapped. "And I intend to pursue criminal charges against whoever is responsible." That was her mistake. In front of cameras and witnesses, she had just threatened to arrest someone without evidence, probable cause, or even a specific suspect. Her anger had driven her to make statements that revealed the corrupt mindset beneath her badge. "Sheriff," the same reporter pressed, "are you saying you plan to file charges against the ranch owner? Based on what evidence?" Corinne realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. She glanced around at the faces watching her, suddenly aware that she was being recorded making threats she could not legally follow through on. "The investigation will determine responsibility," she said, trying to backtrack. "But you just accused someone of criminal sabotage without any proof," the reporter continued. "Is this how you normally conduct law enforcement in this county?" I watched Corinne's face cycle through anger, frustration, and growing panic as she realized she was digging herself deeper with every word. "This interview is over," she announced, stalking toward her patrol car. But the damage was done. The cameras had captured not just the chaotic horse ride, but her unprofessional response to being embarrassed. They had recorded her making threats and accusations without evidence. Most importantly, they had documented the moment when her mask of professional competence slipped completely. As the politicians and reporters packed up to leave, several of them approached me privately. "That was quite a show," the state senator murmured with a barely suppressed smile. "I am as surprised as anyone," I replied. "I imagine you are." He handed me his business card. "If you have any problems with local law enforcement retaliation, give my office a call." After everyone had gone, I stood in my corral surrounded by 30 sets of cowbells and felt something I had not experienced in months. Hope. The video went viral within 6 hours. By Monday morning, the footage of Sheriff Corinne clinging to her spooked horse while cowbells clanged had been viewed more than 50,000 times on social media. Local news stations were running the story as their lead segment. The state newspaper published a front-page article titled, "Law Enforcement Event Goes Off the Rails." But the real impact began when other people started coming forward. Martha Henderson called me Tuesday afternoon. She owned the bakery downtown and had been pressured into providing free catering for Corinne's previous events. "I thought I was the only one," she said. Karen told me that health department inspections could be very thorough if business owners were not supportive of law enforcement. By Wednesday, my phone was ringing constantly. Jake Morrison from the auto shop had been forced to provide free maintenance on patrol cars. Susan Wright from the hotel had been coerced into hosting law enforcement conferences without compensation. Tom Bradley from the construction company had been pressured into donating materials for the sheriff's department renovations. All of them had the same story: veiled threats, implied consequences, the systematic abuse of authority to extract free goods and services from local businesses. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Thursday morning, a reporter from the state attorney general's office called to ask about my experiences with Sheriff Karen. Friday, an investigator from the state police internal affairs division scheduled an appointment to interview me about corruption allegations. Karen tried to fight back, but every move she made only made things worse. She issued a press release claiming that disgruntled individuals were trying to undermine law enforcement through false allegations and publicity stunts. She held a press conference to deny any wrongdoing and to threaten legal action against those spreading malicious rumors. But the cowbell video had done something that months of quiet complaints could not accomplish. It had made her look ridiculous, and ridiculous authority figures lose their power to intimidate. Local business owners who had been afraid to speak out suddenly found their courage. The weekly newspaper published a three-part series documenting Karen's pattern of abuse. The town council called for an independent investigation. Even her own deputies began distancing themselves from her leadership. "I never felt comfortable with some of the sheriff's methods," Deputy Morrison told a reporter, "but I thought that was just how things were done here." The investigation revealed financial irregularities in the department budget, thousands of dollars in donations that had been solicited through official pressure, equipment and services obtained through intimidation rather than proper procurement processes. Karen's attempts to deflect blame only accelerated her downfall. She claimed the investigation was politically motivated. She accused me of orchestrating a conspiracy against law enforcement. She threatened to sue anyone who questioned her integrity. Every statement she made sounded more desperate and unhinged than the last. The breaking point came when the state police discovered she had been using department resources for personal events, official vehicles for private transportation, department employees working her political fundraisers on county time, equipment purchases that somehow ended up at her residence. 3 weeks after the cowbell incident, the state attorney general announced that Sheriff Karen was under investigation for official misconduct, abuse of authority, and misuse of public resources. She tried to blame me for everything. In her final press conference before being placed on administrative leave, she claimed that my criminal sabotage had triggered a witch hunt designed to destroy her career. But by then, nobody was listening to her anymore. The woman who had used fear and intimidation to control an entire community had been brought down by 30 brass cowbells and her own arrogance. 6 months later, former Sheriff Karen pleaded guilty to 3 felony counts of official misconduct and was sentenced to 2 years in state prison. The courtroom was packed with business owners and citizens she had intimidated during her reign of corruption. I sat in the front row, watching as the judge read the charges that detailed her systematic abuse of authority. The defendant used the power and prestige of her office to coerce citizens into providing goods and services without compensation, the judge stated. She threatened official retaliation against those who refused to comply with her demands. She converted public resources to personal use and violated the public trust in the most fundamental way. Karen stood at the defendant's table, no longer wearing the uniform that had been her weapon of choice. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of the authority she had wielded so carelessly. When given the opportunity to address the court, she offered a brief apology that focused more on her own suffering than on the damage she had caused. "I made mistakes in judgment," she said, "but I never intended to harm anyone." The judge was not impressed. "The harm you caused was not accidental," he replied. "It was the predictable result of systematic corruption that you pursued for personal gain." As Karen was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at the cost of destroying trust in local law enforcement that would take years to rebuild. The new sheriff, elected in a special election, was a 20-year veteran of the state police with no previous connection to our county. One of his first official acts was to visit my ranch to apologize for his predecessor's behavior. "What she did was criminal," he told me as we stood in the same corral where the cowbell incident had occurred. "But I want you to know that her actions do not represent the values of professional law enforcement." I appreciated his words, but I also understood that trust, once broken, requires time and consistent action to repair. The ranch returned to its peaceful routine. The horses grazed in pastures unmarked by yellow tape or tire tracks from patrol cars. Visitors came to buy foals and admire our breeding program, not to stage political photo opportunities. But the most significant change was in myself. For months, I had felt powerless against Karen's abuse of authority. I had been trapped by the assumption that official power could not be challenged by ordinary citizens. The cowbell incident had taught me that sometimes the most effective resistance comes not from direct confrontation, but from creative responses that expose corruption to public scrutiny. The story spread far beyond our small county. I received calls from ranchers and business owners in other states who were dealing with similar problems. The video became a symbol of successful resistance against petty tyranny. A year later, the state legislature passed new laws strengthening oversight of local law enforcement and creating better protections for citizens who report official misconduct. They called it the Cowbell Reform Act, in recognition of the incident that had inspired the investigation into corruption in rural counties. I still have those 30 sets of cowbells. They hang in my barn now, cleaned and polished, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can create the loudest calls for justice. Every morning when I walk through the barn to check on the horses, they catch the sunlight and gleam like brass beacons of hope. They remind me that corruption thrives in silence and secrecy, but it cannot survive the bright light of public exposure. Sheriff Karen thought she could use her badge to intimidate and control. She thought her authority made her untouchable. She learned too late that in America, no one is above the law and no authority is beyond accountability. The cowbells taught her that lesson in the most public way possible. And every time the wind moves through the barn and those bells chime softly in the breeze, I am reminded that sometimes the sweetest sound in the world is the sound of justice being served.